The air above the Solomon Sea was thin and biting cold. At 18,000 feet, the horizon shimmered like glass, fragile and sharp. Japanese pilots scanned the sky with the confidence of hunters who had ruled the Pacific for years. Their Zeros had carried them from victory to victory, swift, agile, seemingly untouchable. But on this day, February 1943, their confidence began to crack. Through the glare of the morning sun, a dark shape appeared. Its outline was strange, almost menacing, wings bent downward like the talons of a predator, a massive propeller turning with relentless force. The machine did not dive or turn to engage in the way they expected. Instead it climbed. Higher. Stronger. Defying the logic of everything they thought they knew about aerial combat. 1-0 strained to follow. The pilot pulled back hard, feeling his engine scream in protest, the wings rattling as if they might break apart. But the American fighter rose effortlessly, leaving him behind. In that moment, the hunter realized he had become the hunted. What must that have felt like? To suddenly know that no matter how skilled you were, no matter how bravely you fought, the sky itself now favored your enemy? This was the arrival of the F4U Corsair. Its very presence in the Pacific changed the balance of power. With terrifying speed, crushing firepower, and a haunting whistle in its dive, it dismantled not only Japan's aircraft but also its warrior spirit. The pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, once convinced of their own invincibility, began to feel something new, fear. And that fear would only grow. Tonight, we tell the story of how one aircraft broke the confidence of an entire generation of elite aviators. How it turned their triumph into terror, their hunting grounds into graveyards, their warrior code into a desperate search for survival. This is not just a story of machines but of men who faced a truth too heavy to deny, that courage alone cannot overcome technology, and that spirit cannot outrun industry. Before we dive deep into this saga of the bent-winged bird known as Whistling Death, let me ask you, do you enjoy these long-form journeys into history, the kind that let you sit back, close your eyes, and imagine yourself in those skies in those moments? If you do, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Join a community of history enthusiasts who believe that the past still speaks to us, teaching lessons about courage, innovation, and the price of war. And when you finish listening today, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the Japanese pilots were justified in their fear? Could any spirit have withstood the Corsair's power? Your reflections make these stories richer, and I look forward to reading them. So, settle in, adjust your headset, and let the engines roar to life in your imagination. The story begins now. The Pacific War was still young in 1942, yet its opening chapters had already reshaped the world. Across Asia and the Pacific, Japanese forces moved with a speed and confidence that stunned both allies and enemies. In the air, their edge was absolute. The aircraft that carried their hopes, the Mitsubishi A6M0, seemed to embody everything the warrior spirit promised: speed, agility, reach. It turned the vast Pacific into a hunting ground, and for a time, its pilots ruled it with unmatched assurance. The Zero was not simply a machine. To the men who flew it, it was an extension of their own identity. It symbolized Japan's technological ingenuity and its cultural belief that discipline and willpower could overcome any obstacle. By 1942, Allied pilots whispered about it with a mixture of fear and respect. It could turn tighter than any American or British fighter. It could fly farther than almost anything else in the air. And in the hands of the highly trained Japanese naval aviators, it seemed nearly untouchable. Numbers confirmed the legend. Reports from China, Burma, the Philippines, and the waters off Malaya all spoke of devastating losses. In some sectors, the Zero achieved kill ratios as high as 12-1. Against British Hurricanes, against American P-40s and F-4F Wildcats, the story repeated. Allied fighters fell in flames, while Zeros returned home victorious. These were not isolated duels. They were patterns, etched into statistics that commanders could not ignore. But behind those victories stood a cadre of pilots forged in the hardest crucible any Air Force had ever designed. The Outrun preparatory course and the subsequent naval flight training program were brutal by design. Of thousands who applied, only a few dozen might survive the process. 3 years of relentless pressure, physical exhaustion, constant drills, merciless evaluations. Even before combat, candidates died in accidents or from sheer exhaustion. For those who emerged, the result was something extraordinary. Young men who had endured more flight hours before their first combat sortie than many Allied pilots logged in their entire pre-war training. By 1943, the average Japanese carrier pilot had amassed around 800 hours in the cockpit. Some veterans carried with them over 2,000 hours, sharpened in the skies over China. This made them the most experienced naval aviators in the world. They did not just know their aircraft, they could feel it as a living thing responsive to every subtle touch. To these men, the Zero was invincible because their skill made it so. And they had reason to believe. Pearl Harbor had humbled America. British carriers had been sunk in the Indian Ocean. The skies from Burma to the Gilberts seemed to bend beneath the rising sun. Every engagement reinforced the same lesson, that training, courage, and spirit outweighed brute industrial power. For a nation with far fewer resources than the United States, this belief was not simply pride, it was survival. The doctrine they carried into battle was shaped by both philosophy and necessity. Japanese fighter tactics emphasized the individual pilot. Aggressive maneuvers, precision strikes, and daring risk-taking were considered virtues. The idea was not to outlast the enemy in attrition, but to outfly him, to break his will by sheer audacity. The spirit of the warrior is our shield, instructors told them. Armor was unnecessary, fuel protection was redundant. Why weigh down an aircraft with steel when speed and maneuver could keep a pilot alive? And for years this philosophy seemed to work. The Zero achieved its reputation not only because of what it was, but because of what its enemies were not. In 1942, American and British fighters in the Pacific were designs already verging on obsolescence. Wildcats, P-40s, and Buffaloes struggled to match the Zero in climb, in turn, and often in firepower. Pilots had to invent new tactics, boom and zoom, slashing attacks, dive and escape maneuvers, just to survive. For many Allied squadrons, survival itself felt like a victory. Now place yourself in the cockpit of a Japanese pilot in early 1943. You are young but already hardened by years of war. You know your Zero will turn inside any opponent. You know that your comrades are among the finest flyers in the world. You carry with you not only your own skill but the weight of cultural expectation. The Bushido Code, the warrior's path, the belief that spirit conquers steel. You look down upon American machines and see clumsy designs that rely on armor and weight instead of skill and daring. And you tell yourself, we will never be defeated. But war is not static. Every advantage has its half-life. In American factories thousands of miles away, engineers and assembly lines were churning out aircraft that would soon rewrite the balance. American pilots, once hurried through training with just a few dozen hours in the air, were now receiving longer, more rigorous instruction. Gun camera footage was studied. Tactics were refined. Doctrine evolved. Piece by piece the imbalance was being corrected. The stage for this reckoning was the Solomon Islands. Here, in the humid jungles and narrow seas, Japanese and American forces clashed in a grinding campaign of attrition. On land, soldiers fought for airstrips hacked from coral. At sea, ships dueled across narrow straits in midnight battles. And in the skies, aviators faced one another in desperate, swirling combats that decided who would control the lifeline of supply and reinforcement. For months, Japanese pilots continued to hold their edge. The Zero remained lethal. But then, on February 12, 1943, a new aircraft arrived at Guadalcanal. It bore a shape that immediately drew comment. Bent wings like the wings of a gull, a massive four-bladed propeller, a nose so long it seemed almost ungainly. To some, it looked awkward. To others, monstrous. To all, it was unfamiliar. 2 days later, it tasted combat for the first time. On Valentine's Day, American Corsairs escorted bombers toward Bougainville. The clash that followed was brutal. 9 Allied aircraft were lost against a single Zero destroyed. On paper, it looked like another Japanese victory. But statistics sometimes conceal deeper truths. That day, Japanese pilots saw something they could not see. The new American fighter climbed where no American fighter had climbed before. It dove at speeds no Zero could match. It shrugged off damage that would have torn their machines apart. For the first time in years, Japanese aviators found themselves looking at opponents who simply refused to play by the old rules. Could it have been just an anomaly? A handful of machines easily countered with better tactics? Or was it something larger, something that hinted at a shift more dangerous than any pilot had imagined? The Corsair had arrived. And with it came a creeping sense of unease. That unease would grow into fear. That fear would become certainty. And certainty would break the spirit of even Japan's most elite. The first shock came not in numbers but in sensations. Japanese pilots were accustomed to measuring superiority by how it felt in the cockpit. Against Wildcats or P-40s, the advantage was obvious. When they pulled back on the stick, their Zero responded instantly, banking hard into a tight turn that no American aircraft could match. They felt the confidence that comes from knowing, if the enemy tries to follow, he will stall or spin, and you will have him in your sights. But against the Corsair, something unexpected happened. In those first encounters over Bougainville, Japanese aviators noticed that the American fighters were not trying to turn with them at all. Instead they climbed. They dove. They seemed to choose their own fight, and when a Zero tried to pursue, the Corsair simply pulled away. The sensation was jarring. To a Japanese pilot, it felt like trying to grasp smoke. No matter how aggressively he maneuvered, the enemy escaped the trap. This was the Corsair's first secret: speed. At sea level, the F4U could reach over 400 miles per hour, nearly 80 miles per hour faster than the Zero. In a dive, the difference became even more terrifying. The Corsair's massive propeller and powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine gave it strength the Zero could not match. Pilots reported that Zeros began to shudder violently above 350 miles per hour. Beyond that, their control surfaces stiffened, their wings threatened to rip away. But Corsairs could plummet past 500 miles per hour, their wings flexing but holding, their pilots still able to maneuver. What did this mean in practice? It meant the American pilot could always choose. If he wanted to escape, he could dive away. If he wanted to attack, he could swoop in from above, unleash his 6.50 caliber machine guns, and climb back out before the Zero could even bring its nose around. Japanese pilots soon learned the bitter truth. The hunter's privilege of dictating combat had been stolen. The initiative no longer belonged to them. The second shock was firepower. The Zero carried two 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons. On paper, this seemed formidable. In practice, the weapons were light, designed for short bursts at close range. A skilled Japanese pilot could rip apart an unarmored opponent, but if his aim faltered, the chance was lost. The Corsair, by contrast, carried 6 Browning .50 caliber M2 machine guns, each with hundreds of rounds. These were not delicate tools. They were hammers, spitting streams of heavy rounds that could tear through aluminum, steel, and flesh with equal ease. Japanese pilots described the experience of being hit by Corsair fire as unlike anything they had faced before. A single burst could shred control surfaces, ignite fuel, or simply disintegrate the cockpit. One pilot years later admitted, "When the Corsair fired, you did not dodge, you prayed." And the Corsair could fire from farther away. Its heavy rounds retained lethal velocity at ranges beyond what the Zero's 7.7mm guns could manage. Suddenly, the distances of combat shifted. Japanese pilots who once pressed in close, confident they could dance around enemy guns, found themselves cut down before their cannons could even open fire. The third shock was resilience. For years, the Zero's invincibility had rested on the skill of its pilots. They avoided hits by never being where the bullets flew. But the Corsair was designed differently. American engineers assumed that pilots would make mistakes, that enemies would get their shots. So they armored the cockpit. They installed self-sealing fuel tanks. They built a frame that could take hits and keep flying. At first, Japanese pilots believed they were scoring victories. They watched tracers stitch across Corsair wings, saw fuel leak, saw smoke trail. But again and again the American fighters clawed their way home. Some landed riddled with holes, their wings shredded, but their pilots alive. For Japanese aviators, who knew that even a few hits could set their fragile Zeros ablaze, this was disheartening in the extreme. What good was skill if the enemy's machine could absorb your best effort and still return tomorrow? In the ready rooms, whispers began. We cannot outclimb them. We cannot outrun them. And if we shoot them, they do not fall. 4 men raced to believe that willpower and courage were supreme. This was not merely a tactical problem, it was a philosophical one. But perhaps the most devastating shock was psychological. For years, Japanese pilots had been taught that the warrior spirit would always triumph. They believed that the American reliance on armor and heavy firepower was proof of weakness. The Americans build machines for cowards, one instructor told his students. Yet in combat the reality reversed. It was the American pilots who now attacked boldly, diving into the fray with confidence that their machines could protect them. It was the Japanese who began to hesitate, who began to wonder whether their courage was enough. Imagine sitting in a briefing room on Rabaul, listening to the reports come in. The Zero is still feared, still respected, but the Americans have something new. Pilots describe the Corsair as a monster, a machine that dives like a hawk and hits like a thunderclap. You tell yourself it cannot be true. And yet, deep down you begin to sense the horizon shifting. What happens to a warrior when his faith falters? What happens to a hunter when he realizes the prey has grown stronger than he is? These were questions Japanese pilots had never asked themselves before. Now, in the skies above the Solomons, they had no choice. And the Corsair was only just beginning to show what it could do. The shock of the Corsair was not limited to speed, firepower, and armor. Its very presence in the sky carried a weight that Japanese pilots could not ignore. Consider the silhouette, the inverted gull wings, bent downward before sweeping upward again. No other fighter looked like this. At a distance, Japanese observers could identify it instantly. And with recognition came dread. For men who once felt pride in spotting Zeros dominating the skies, now the tables had turned. Seeing those bent wings was like spotting a predator in the wild. You knew instinctively you were no longer the hunter. Then there was the sound. The Corsair's wing root oil coolers produced a strange, piercing whine during high-speed dives. American pilots came to relish it, calling their plane whistling death. For the Japanese, the sound became a curse. Pilots described the whistle echoing even in their dreams. Some claimed that just hearing it in combat created an involuntary tightening of the stomach, a physical response to fear. Imagine being on the ground at Rabaul, hearing that shriek above as Corsairs dove through your airfield, sometimes not even firing, just reminding you of their presence. The sound was more than noise, it was a message. It told Japanese pilots, "We can strike you when we please. You cannot stop us." This was psychological warfare delivered not through propaganda leaflets or radio broadcasts, but through the mechanics of an aircraft. The tactical results soon followed. In late 1943, the Black Sheep Squadron VMF 214, under Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, arrived in the Solomons with their Corsairs. Boyington, a flamboyant, often reckless leader, quickly understood how to exploit the Corsair's strengths. He taught his men to fight vertically, not horizontally. Never try to turn with a Zero, he told them. Go above him, dive through and climb away. On December 17, 1943, Boyington led 31 Corsairs as escort for a bombing raid against Rabaul. Waiting for them were 40 Zeros, flown by some of Japan's best surviving pilots. On paper the odds were nearly even. But in practice it was no contest. The Corsairs climbed to 25,000 feet, altitude at which the Zero became sluggish and unresponsive. As the Japanese strained to climb after them, the Americans dove like hawks, their 6 guns spitting fire, then zoomed back to altitude before the Zeros could react. 11 Japanese planes were destroyed. 2 Corsairs returned damaged. None were lost. What must it have felt like for the Japanese pilots that day? Imagine watching your comrades burst into flames while you struggled even to aim at the enemy. Imagine realizing that no matter how hard you climbed, the foe remained untouchable above you. The outcome was more than a tactical defeat. It was a revelation. The methods that had worked for years, the tight turns, the sudden dives, the daring spirit, no longer applied. The rules of aerial combat had changed, and the Japanese were learning those new rules in the harshest possible classroom. Another example came with the story of Lieutenant Robert M. Hansen, a Marine Corps ace. In just 17 days in January 1944, Hansen shot down 20 Japanese aircraft flying the Corsair. 17 days. Japanese pilots facing him reported that the sight of Corsairs entering combat caused formations to scatter. The will to fight dissolved before the first shot was even fired. What happens when fear replaces aggression? When hesitation seeps into the reflexes of a fighter pilot? The answer is grim. Survival instincts take over. Japanese aviators who once pressed attacks to the bitter end now began to disengage at the first sign of those bent wings. The Corsair had reversed the psychology of battle. The effect cascaded. Veterans, men who had once mentored new pilots, now found themselves shielding raw recruits with barely 100 hours of flight training. They knew the rookies stood no chance against Corsair-equipped squadrons. Many experienced pilots described the helplessness of watching their young wingmen torn apart within seconds, unable to protect them. The traditional Japanese system of pairing novices with veterans collapsed. Survival became individual, lonely, desperate. And still the Corsair evolved. By late 1943, newer models, the F4U 1A, introduced improved visibility, more armor, and even greater performance. Later versions carried bombs and rockets, turning the Corsair into a fighter bomber capable of striking ground targets with as much ferocity as it dominated the skies. Japanese pilots could no longer hope that airfields or supply depots offered respite. Corsairs could dive bomb them by day, hunt them at night, and sweep their skies clean whenever they attempted to rise. There is a moment in every war when one side realizes not just that it is losing, but that it cannot win. For Japanese naval aviators, that moment came with the Corsair. The statistics, speed, climb rate, firepower, were undeniable. But statistics alone do not crush morale. It was the lived experience, the feeling of helplessness in the cockpit, that truly broke them. The Corsair was not just an airplane. It was an idea, a symbol of industrial strength and technological mastery that Japan could not match. Each time a Zero burned, each time a Corsair returned to base riddled with holes but intact, that idea grew stronger. So the question must be asked, what does a warrior do when he realizes his courage, his training, his very philosophy cannot alter the outcome? For many Japanese pilots, the answer was silence. They flew less aggressively. They avoided combat when Corsairs were sighted. They clung to survival, even as survival became increasingly unlikely. The terror was not irrational. It was the rational conclusion of men who saw the truth. They were facing an opponent they could not outfly, outgun, or outlast. And they knew it. But the story does not end there. Because what followed was not just tactical defeat, but the unraveling of an entire doctrine. The Corsair didn't just win battles. It shattered belief systems. By 1943, the Corsair's presence in the Pacific exposed another devastating truth. Japan was running out of pilots. Not just aircraft pilots. The very lifeblood of its naval aviation was being drained, faster than it could be replaced. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators had been the elite of the elite. The training pipeline was brutally selective. Fewer than 2% of applicants were accepted into the Outrun preparatory course. Of those, many washed out, or died before earning wings. Those who survived arrived in combat with years of preparation and hundreds of flying hours. Some veterans of China had logged over 2,000 hours before 1941. This was the force that struck Pearl Harbor. It was the force that humiliated the British at Singapore, that swept across the Pacific in the opening months of the war. And it was this force that now faced the Corsair. But by mid-1943, combat attrition had gutted the veteran corps. Every month, more irreplaceable aces fell to American guns. The math was cruel. For every Japanese pilot lost, there was no equivalent replacement. Training had been shortened drastically due to fuel shortages and the sheer urgency of war. New recruits who once might have flown 500 to 700 training hours now received as little as 150. By 1945, some were thrown into battle with just 40 or 50 hours of flying time, barely enough to control their aircraft, let alone fight against the likes of the Corsair. Think of it. An American pilot might arrive in the Pacific with 600 hours of training, including hundreds of gunnery drills and high-altitude exercises. His Japanese counterpart, by the end of the war, might never have fired his guns in training. The imbalance was staggering. What did this mean in the air? Veterans described formations breaking apart at the first sign of combat. Experienced leaders, already outnumbered, were forced to babysit rookies who panicked under fire. Many were killed before they even saw their attackers. Corsairs diving from above moved so fast that novice pilots had no chance to react. A burst of fire and they were gone. The traditional Japanese system had relied on mentorship, an ace paired with a younger flyer, passing down wisdom in the crucible of battle. But by 1944, there were too few veterans left to guide the novices. The system collapsed. Instead of a chain of experience, there was a widening gap of ignorance. The Corsair widened it with merciless efficiency. Consider the experience of Kenneth Walsh, the first Corsair ace. Walsh later admitted that fighting the Zero became mechanical. His words were chilling: climb above them, dive through, fire a burst, zoom, climb back to safety, repeat. There was no duel, no back-and-forth contest of skill. It was repetition. A process. And this process devoured rookies. What must it have been like for a young Japanese pilot strapped into a Zero with trembling hands, knowing you had only flown a handful of training missions, facing opponents with hundreds of hours of preparation and a machine that outclassed yours in every measurable way? Was it courage to take off at all, or resignation? The veterans felt the weight too. They were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting to protect children. Many wrote in diaries of their despair, watching novices disintegrate in flames, knowing they could not shield them. That despair was as deadly as enemy bullets. The imbalance of training and technology also stripped away the Japanese doctrine of individual skill. For years, their philosophy had emphasized the superiority of the warrior spirit, Bushido, in overcoming material disadvantages. But what good was spirit when your guns jammed after 7 seconds of firing, while the Corsair spat continuous streams of lead? What good was maneuverability when your plane crumbled in a dive long before your enemy lost control? Each failed dogfight was not just a lost aircraft. It was a lesson that everything they had believed, about training, about courage, about the supremacy of skill, was false. By 1944, this realization became unbearable. It was one thing to lose battles. It was another to realize that the foundation of your entire military doctrine had crumbled beneath you. And yet, the Japanese kept flying. Outnumbered, outtrained, outgunned, they went up day after day. Was it bravery? Duty? Fatalism? Perhaps all three. But the results were the same. Each mission fed more young lives into the maw of industrial war. Meanwhile, the Corsair itself grew deadlier. Later versions gained the ability to carry bombs, rockets, even napalm. What began as a fighter became a terror from above, striking airfields, shipping, and jungle hideouts with equal ease. Japanese pilots had once counted on sanctuary at night or in poor weather. But radar-equipped night-fighting Corsairs stripped that safety away too. There was nowhere left to hide. This shift was more than tactical. It was cultural. The Japanese way of the warrior had always honored the duel, the contest of equals. But against the Corsair there was no duel. Only one-sided destruction. Courage had become irrelevant. Skill had become irrelevant. Even survival became a matter of luck. And when luck is your only ally, how long can morale survive? The answer lay in the increasingly desperate measures of the Japanese command. By late 1944, when defeat in the skies became undeniable, a grim new tactic appeared, the kamikaze. If pilots could not win in the air, they would sacrifice themselves against ships. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi admitted privately that suicide attacks were born not of honor, but necessity. His men could no longer face American fighters. The Corsair was central to that decision. It had turned the air war into execution. And in doing so, it pushed Japan from warrior combat to sacrificial desperation. So ask yourself, what is more terrifying, to die fighting a worthy opponent, or to live long enough to realize your entire code of honor has become obsolete? For Japanese pilots, the Corsair forced that question again and again. And every time the answer chipped away at their spirit. By late 1943, the Pacific skies had changed forever. The Zero, once the terror of the ocean, had been eclipsed. The Corsair, along with its sibling the Hellcat, did more than win individual battles. They dismantled an entire system of warfare. And nowhere was this more visible than at Rabaul. Rabaul was no ordinary base. It was the fortress of Japan's South Pacific strategy, a sprawling stronghold carved into the jungle and volcanic rock of New Britain. Underground tunnels housed supplies, command centers, and entire squadrons of aircraft. To the Japanese, Rabaul was impregnable. Yet even this bastion could not withstand the Corsair. In October 1943, when Marine squadrons equipped with Corsairs began operating against Rabaul, the Japanese threw everything they had into defense. Elite units, pilots who had survived since the early days of the war, were concentrated there. For months, the skies above Rabaul saw furious combat. And time after time the pattern repeated. Corsairs climbed higher, struck faster, and returned home more often. In one major raid in December 1943, American squadrons, including Boyington's Black Sheep, cut through Japanese interceptors with devastating efficiency. 11 Zeros destroyed, only a couple Corsairs damaged. The fortress was strong on the ground, but helpless in the air. What did that mean for Japanese pilots? Rabaul was supposed to be their safe harbor, the core of their defensive ring. Instead, it became the place where their confidence was broken. From there, the collapse accelerated. By mid-1944, the focus shifted to the Mariana Islands. The Americans knew that capturing Saipan, Tinian, and Guam would bring Japan itself into bomber range. For the Japanese, it was unthinkable to lose them. They mobilized everything, hundreds of aircraft, including many of the last veteran pilots. The result was the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Americans remember it as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The numbers are staggering. Some 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed against roughly 130 American losses. Many Japanese pilots never even saw their attackers. Corsairs and Hellcats struck from higher altitudes, faster dives, and longer ranges. Imagine climbing into your Zero that morning knowing the stakes. You are defending the empire itself. And within minutes of takeoff, you are diving, turning, desperately trying to catch a shadow that vanishes above you. Then gunfire, flames, silence. What kind of courage can withstand that? Survivors described formations disintegrating, radios filled with shouts of confusion and despair. One veteran pilot later wrote that the sky itself seemed to belong to the Americans. He wasn't describing numbers or tactics, he was describing a feeling. Ownership. Control. The Japanese no longer owned the sky. The consequences of the Philippine Sea were irreversible. Japan lost not only aircraft but pilots, men who could never be replaced. The Americans, meanwhile, replaced losses with new planes, new pilots, more squadrons. Industrial war had reached its climax. And the Corsair was emblematic of that climax. The numbers told the story. A Corsair could exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive while remaining controllable. A Zero risked structural failure above 410. The Corsair's 6.50 caliber machine guns hurled nearly 70 pounds of lead every second. The Zero's mixed armament produced barely 13. The Corsair climbed to 20,000 feet in under 8 minutes. The Zero needed 11. These were not small differences. They were chasms. And yet, the statistics only capture part of it. The true devastation lay in the psychological recognition of those differences. When a pilot knows his plane is slower, weaker, and less survivable, every engagement begins with doubt. And in aerial combat, doubt kills. The terror of the Corsair was not abstract. It was visible in the behaviors of Japanese pilots. Reports from American aviators tell of Zeros diving for the deck at the first sight of the bent wing silhouette. Of formations scattering rather than facing the inevitable clash. Of pilots refusing to take off when Corsairs were reported in the vicinity. This is not cowardice. It is recognition. The recognition that the fight is already lost before it begins. Consider the case of Lieutenant Robert Hansen, who scored 20 victories in just 17 days. His mere presence in the sky was enough to unravel Japanese formations. What can doctrine, what can courage, what can spirit do against such inevitability? The answer was clear to Japan's commanders. They could no longer fight for control of the skies. Instead, they turned to desperate measures. Kamikaze attacks, once unthinkable, became official policy by late 1944. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of the kamikaze, admitted the truth privately: "Our pilots cannot face the American fighters. They will die without meaning. Better that they die with purpose." It was a chilling statement. And at its core was the Corsair. An aircraft so dominant that it forced a proud naval air service to abandon combat and embrace suicide as strategy. Ask yourself, what kind of weapon can do that? Not merely destroy aircraft, but destroy the very idea of aerial warfare for your enemy? The Corsair did. And it was not finished. For in 1945, its role expanded even further. It became not just a fighter, not just a bomber, but a symbol of inevitability. Wherever Japanese forces gathered, the Corsair arrived. Over Okinawa, it flew thousands of sorties, claiming hundreds of victories and delivering tons of ordnance. Against this storm, Japanese pilots, many with less than 30 hours of training, were swept away in seconds. The story of these battles is not just about tactics or machines. It is about transformation. The Corsair transformed Japan's air war from one of daring offense to desperate defense, from individual duels to industrial slaughter, from warriors seeking glory to men hoping only for survival. And survival was slipping away. By 1944, Japanese naval aviation was not just weakening, it was unraveling. Every encounter with Corsairs deepened the sense of futility. Every mission turned into a gamble with odds no sane man would accept. And yet the orders kept coming: fly, fight, defend. But there was no defense. The Corsair had evolved again, and with each iteration the gap widened. The F4U 1D, for example, could carry nearly 2 tons of bombs, more than many Japanese twin-engine bombers, while still outperforming every enemy fighter in the Pacific. Rockets were added, turning the Corsair into a tank buster and ship killer. Napalm tanks followed, searing the jungles where Japanese soldiers sought refuge. Now imagine you are a Japanese pilot in 1944. Your aircraft is lighter, weaker, and slower. You are short on fuel. You have been told that the warrior's spirit will make up the difference. But when you rise to meet the enemy, you discover that the same plane shooting down your comrades is also leveling your airfield, torching your supplies, and smashing the very runways you depend upon. How do you fight such an enemy? And then came the night. Until 1944, Japanese pilots could at least count on darkness for respite. Most American fighters lacked the equipment to operate effectively after sunset. But the Corsair shattered that illusion as well. A specialized variant, the F4U-2, was fitted with airborne radar and flown by squadrons trained in night interception. Only 36 were built, yet their impact was profound. They hunted Japanese aircraft under cover of darkness, stalking bombers that had once raided American positions with impunity. Suddenly, the night was no longer safe. A Japanese pilot could be torn from the sky by an unseen predator, destroyed before he even knew he was being followed. Think about the psychology of that. Daytime had already become a slaughterhouse. Now night offered no shelter. Pilots who once joked that the darkness belonged to Japan began to dread even takeoff after sunset. This sense of inevitability seeped into every corner of the Japanese war effort. Veterans who had once flown boldly now hesitated. Young recruits, already barely trained, saw their first combat in hopeless conditions. Survival rates plummeted. And yet, the machine of war demanded more. The Japanese high command, watching losses mount, turned to the most extreme solution imaginable: deliberate suicide. The kamikaze was not born from culture alone. It was born from necessity. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi may have dressed his order in the language of honor, but his private admission revealed the truth. Conventional combat is impossible. Better that they die with purpose. In other words, our pilots cannot survive against Corsairs and Hellcats. Our planes cannot compete. Our training pipeline has collapsed. The only way left to inflict damage is to turn men themselves into weapons. It is difficult to overstate the weight of that decision. For centuries, Japan's warrior tradition had prized courage, skill, and sacrifice. But sacrifice was meant to serve victory. Now, sacrifice became the only strategy left. What greater sign of defeat could there be? And still the Corsair pressed on. American pilots, armed with overwhelming technical advantages, achieved victory rates that defied belief. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington scored 22 of his 26 victories in Corsairs, often describing combat as routine, even mechanical. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh called the Corsair so superior that it felt unfair. Unfair. That word says everything. The duel of warriors had become a one-sided execution. Consider also the numbers. By early 1945, Corsairs claimed more than 2,000 aerial victories against fewer than 200 combat losses, a kill ratio over 11-1. But statistics alone cannot capture the human reality. For every Corsair that returned home with bullet holes patched and armor dented, there were dozens of Zeros burning in the jungle, their pilots gone forever. What must it have been like, as a Japanese ace, to realize that your own skill no longer mattered? That even your finest maneuver could not change the outcome? Many veterans later admitted that by 1944, the wisest choice was simple: avoid combat if Corsairs were sighted. Survival became resistance. Escape became victory. The Americans knew this too, and exploited it. Corsair squadrons often performed terror dives over enemy airfields, not even firing their guns, simply letting the piercing whistle echo over the ground. Japanese pilots and ground crews would scatter. Morale plummeted. The war had become as much about psychology as about bullets. And the psychology was devastating. By 1945, the gap between the two sides was absolute. American pilots were trained in industrial numbers, tens of thousands, each with hundreds of flight hours. Japanese pilots, by contrast, sometimes entered combat with less than 50 hours. Some had never fired their weapons before their first mission. How could they possibly hope to face a veteran in a Corsair? The truth is, they couldn't. And many didn't even try. Instead, they were ordered to aim their planes at ships. Suicide was rebranded as strategy. The Corsair had stripped away every other option. Ask yourself, what other weapon in history has forced an enemy to abandon the very concept of combat? Not a bomb, not a fleet, not an army, but a single type of aircraft. The Corsair did. And its lesson was clear. In modern war, courage without technology is slaughter. Spirit without industry is suicide. Okinawa. Spring 1945. The last great battle before the home islands themselves. For the Japanese, Okinawa was supposed to be the fortress that bled America white. For the Americans, it was the gateway to victory. And in the skies above, the Corsair became not just a fighter, but the hammer that drove the final nails into Japanese air power. Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons operated from carriers offshore and captured airstrips ashore. The numbers alone were staggering. More than 15,000 combat sorties flown, thousands of tons of bombs and rockets unleashed, hundreds of Japanese aircraft destroyed. By this stage of the war, the Corsair was no longer simply contesting air superiority, it was ensuring absolute dominance. But what did dominance really mean in 1945? It meant battles that weren't battles at all. It meant engagements measured in seconds, where green Japanese pilots, many with fewer than 30 total flight hours, were vaporized before they could even point their guns. It meant American pilots, sometimes bored, sometimes disturbed, describing combat as nothing more than execution. Imagine the scene, a formation of Corsairs climbing above 20,000 feet, scanning the sky. Below them, a handful of Japanese planes rise slowly, engines straining, wings shuddering. The Americans dive at nearly 450 miles per hour, fire a burst, then zoom climb back to altitude. The Japanese have no chance to evade, no chance to retaliate. Within minutes, the sky is littered with wreckage. Is this still combat, or is it slaughter? That question haunted both sides. For the Japanese, every destroyed plane was not just a tactical loss, but another reminder that technology had turned their courage into irrelevance. For the Americans, every easy kill reinforced the unsettling truth. Victory was coming, but at a price that no longer felt honorable. And then there were the kamikazes. At Okinawa, the suicide strategy reached its peak. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft dove at American ships, exploding into fireballs on the decks of carriers and destroyers. The Corsair became the shield against this desperate tactic. Day after day, Corsair pilots intercepted incoming attackers, shooting them down before they could strike. But not all were stopped. The horror of kamikaze hits, ships burning, sailors dying, steel twisted, was seared into the memory of every man present. The Japanese had found a way to bypass technological inferiority, at least partially. But ask yourself, what does it mean when your only remaining strategy is to crash into the enemy? Does that reflect strength, or final desperation? For the Japanese pilots forced into these missions, the Corsair was both executioner and tormentor. Even suicide was not guaranteed. Many kamikaze planes were torn apart before reaching their targets. Pilots who had been promised a glorious death instead vanished in smoke, their sacrifice unnoticed, their purpose denied. This was the climax not only of a battle but of an entire philosophy of war. For years, Japan had believed that spirit could overcome material, that the warrior's will was more important than the engineer's blueprint. At Okinawa, that belief disintegrated. Spirit-driven kamikazes were burned from the sky by industrially produced Corsairs. The result was not heroism but annihilation. Consider the numbers. By the end of Okinawa, Corsairs had flown more sorties than any other Navy aircraft type. They had destroyed over 500 enemy planes in the air, countless more on the ground, and delivered enough ordnance to flatten entire regiments. Their loss rate was minimal compared to the destruction they dealt. And the Japanese? Their air arm was finished. The few pilots who survived described combat as hopeless, engagements as suicides. They flew knowing the outcome and knowing it could not change. What does it do to a nation when its bravest men realize their deaths are meaningless? Okinawa provided the answer. In Tokyo, military leaders began to understand that there would be no defense of the home islands by conventional means. Plans for Operation Olympic, the American invasion of Kyushu, were analyzed and the projections were horrifying. America could deploy over 2,000 Corsairs, supported by thousands of other advanced fighters, from 48 carriers and dozens of captured fields. Japan, by contrast, could muster perhaps 2,000 flyable aircraft of all types, most obsolete, most flown by barely trained boys. What would that have looked like? An extermination, not a battle. Some Japanese planners admitted as much. Admiral Somu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, later stated plainly, conventional air combat had become impossible. The only option left was to hide aircraft for kamikaze strikes. Fighter combat, once the pride of Japan, had been rendered obsolete by the Corsair. The climax of the Corsair story, then, is not just its kill counts, not just the battles it won. It is the destruction of an idea. The idea that courage alone could overcome technology, that spirit alone could defeat industry. At Okinawa, that illusion burned away completely. And yet, even as Japan collapsed, the Corsair continued to evolve. Its later variants carried more bombs, more rockets, and even night-fighting radar. Its speed, climb, and dive performance remained unmatched by anything Japan could field. The war might have been nearing its end, but the Corsair was still accelerating, still widening the gap. Think of the irony. By 1945, America was producing more Corsairs each month than Japan was producing fighters of any type. One single American production line outproduced the entire Japanese aviation industry. What chance did Japan ever really have? This is the climax. The moment when technology and industry revealed their full weight. The Corsair was not just a machine. It was the physical embodiment of America's industrial might, a flying factory of death that turned battles into foregone conclusions. At Okinawa, the Japanese pilots finally saw the truth with perfect clarity. Their courage could not save them. Their sacrifice could not change the outcome. Their deaths were not victories but confirmations of defeat. And that realization, far more than any bullet, was the true killing blow. August 1945. The war was ending. Atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Soviet armies were tearing through Manchuria. And yet, for Japan's airmen, the end had already arrived months earlier, high above the Pacific, in the shadow of the bent-winged bird they had come to dread. The Corsair did not just win air battles. It transformed the very psychology of Japan's fighting elite. In 1942, Japanese pilots had entered combat brimming with confidence, convinced that skill and Bushido spirit could carry them through any fight. By 1945, the same men, if they survived at all, spoke in hushed voices of the Corsair as an unstoppable predator. Some admitted they would dive for the clouds at the first sight of those unmistakable wings. What does it mean when the proudest warriors of an empire choose flight over fight? It means the foundation of an entire military philosophy has been shattered. The Corsair had proven that courage was not enough, that no amount of training could bridge a gap in technology and production. For the Japanese, this realization was devastating. For the Americans, it was a revelation of a different kind, that wars in the modern age would not be decided by heroes alone, but by factories, engineers, and logistics. After Japan's surrender, occupation officials invited Japanese officers to tour American aircraft plants. In Connecticut, they walked through a Vought factory still producing Corsairs. The sight was overwhelming: rows of gleaming machines, vast assembly lines, engines rolling off in numbers greater than Japan had ever dreamed. One officer whispered that a single American state produced more aluminum than the entire Japanese empire. How could they have ever hoped to win? This revelation carried profound consequences. For Japan, the war had begun as a crusade of spirit against material weakness. It ended as a lesson in humility. The myth of Yamato Damashii, the belief that the Japanese spirit was uniquely unconquerable, was buried beneath a mountain of American steel. But here lies the paradox. In losing, Japan also found a path to rebirth. The same nation that once believed courage outweighed technology would, within a generation, become one of the world's leading industrial powers. Its engineers, who once struggled to copy American engines, would later design bullet trains and world-class automobiles. Its factories, destroyed in 1945, would rise to become global models of efficiency. In many ways, the Corsair was not just a destroyer of Japan's wartime illusions, it was the harsh teacher that forced Japan to modernize. And what of the pilots themselves? Men like Saburo Sakai, Japan's famed ace, lived to reflect on the war. He later admitted that encountering the Corsair was the moment he knew Japan had lost. Not because of one duel, not because of one defeat, but because America could build such machines by the thousands while Japan could barely maintain what it had. To Sakai, the Corsair was not just an aircraft. It was the embodiment of America's industrial civilization. American pilots, too, were changed by the Corsair. Many spoke of complex emotions, pride in their victories, but also discomfort at the lopsidedness of the fights. By 1945, some said, the Corsair made combat feel less like dueling knights and more like technicians dismantling an inferior product. Was that still war? Or was it industrial execution? That question has never fully left the memory of those who flew. Today, restored Corsairs fly at air shows, their engines growling, their gull wings carving the sky. Crowds cheer at the sight, unaware that for many Japanese veterans, that silhouette once meant terror itself. And when those aircraft dive, the air fills again with the eerie whistle that once haunted enemy dreams. For survivors, it is a sound not of nostalgia but of memory, of friends lost, of a war that turned belief into ashes. So what does the story of the Corsair teach us here and now? It teaches that courage matters, but courage without technology is a candle in a storm. It teaches that spirit can inspire, but without the machinery to back it, spirit alone will break. It teaches that in modern conflict, victory belongs not to those who fight the hardest, but to those who prepare the best. Most of all, it reminds us of the human cost. Every statistic, 2,140 victories, 12,571 aircraft built, 11-to-1 kill ratios, represents lives. Lives ended in fire. Lives changed forever. Young men, both Japanese and American, caught in the gears of history, forced to fight in a sky where technology dictated survival. The Corsair remains a monument to that truth. It was not just a fighter plane. It was an argument made of metal and flame, a statement that in industrial war production lines matter more than samurai codes. It was, as one Japanese pilot later confessed, a teacher of harsh truths. And for us today the question remains, do we remember those truths? The Corsair may be a relic of history, but its lesson is timeless. When nations forget the balance between courage and preparation, between bravery and technology, they risk repeating the same mistakes. The Japanese pilots who feared the Corsair were not cowards. They were rational men who understood reality. And in their fear lay wisdom, the wisdom of recognizing that no amount of courage can change the laws of physics, the mathematics of industry, or the outcome of a battle already decided by production figures. That wisdom cost them dearly. But it gave us a story worth remembering. The war is over. The factories are silent. The skies of the Pacific, once filled with fire and steel, are now empty. But the story of the Corsair and the men who faced it did not end in 1945. Every war leaves behind not only ruins but lessons. Some are written in treaties, some in textbooks, and some in memory. The Corsair's legacy was carved into all three. For Japan, the Corsair was a mirror, reflecting back the harsh truth that their empire had ignored. Courage without resources is futility. Aerial duels that once seemed heroic had turned into massacres. The proud tradition of Bushido could not withstand 2,000 horsepower engines, armored cockpits, and self-sealing fuel tanks. In defeat, Japan was forced to confront an uncomfortable realization. The modern world belonged to engineers, not warriors. But here is the paradox. That realization became the foundation of Japan's post-war rebirth. Stripped of its military, the nation turned its energies to industry. Within 2 decades, Japanese factories rivaled and even surpassed the world's best. By the 1970s, the same country that had once fallen behind in engine design was producing cars, electronics, and ships that astonished the globe. The Corsair, in its terrible way, had been a teacher. It showed Japan what it lacked, and what it could become. For the United States, the Corsair was proof of something larger than victory in one theater. It proved that the fusion of industrial power and technological innovation could reshape the battlefield entirely. It showed that wars were no longer won by individual heroics but by systems, training pipelines, logistics chains, production schedules, and design bureaus. The Corsair was a masterpiece, yes, but it was also a product of a system that could outproduce and outthink any rival. This was the true revolution of the Corsair. It turned air combat into an industrial process. A process that Japan could not match. And what of the men who flew? Their voices still echo. American ace Kenneth Walsh later admitted that flying the Corsair sometimes felt unfair, because of how helpless his opponents seemed. Saburo Sakai confessed that the sight of those gull wings was enough to make him dive for safety. Gregory "Pappy" Boyington joked about the Corsair's toughness. But behind his bravado was the awareness that many of his kills were against boys who never had a chance. Do we listen to those voices today? Or do we remember only the numbers, the ratios, the victories? The Corsair's story reminds us to look deeper. Behind every statistic lies a life. Behind every kill ratio lies grief. For Japanese families, the Corsair meant a son who did not come home. For American families, it meant a father or brother who returned but carried scars. Of combat, of conscience, of memory. And yet, amid the sorrow there is something else. Transformation. The Corsair shattered illusions, but in doing so, it opened a path. It forced Japan to abandon militarism to turn instead toward peace and progress. It reminded America that power carries responsibility, that overwhelming advantage can be both a blessing and a burden. Even today, when restored Corsairs thunder through the skies at airshows, their presence stirs complex emotions. To some, they are beautiful machines, symbols of victory. To others, they are ghosts, reminders of a war that consumed millions. Their whistle in a dive still chills the air, not because it threatens but because it remembers. So what is the final lesson of the Corsair? Perhaps it is this, that in the modern world, courage alone is not enough. Courage must be joined with preparation, spirit with substance, will with wisdom. The Japanese pilots were not cowards. They were men caught in a storm of history, brave enough to fight, wise enough to fear, and human enough to know when defeat was inevitable. Their fear was not weakness, it was understanding. And for us, the living, the heirs of that history, the question is simple yet profound. Will we remember what they learned so painfully? Will we honor not just their courage but their wisdom? Because history has a way of repeating itself. New machines replace old ones, new doctrines replace old codes, but the lesson remains. Spirit is not enough. Industry matters. Technology matters. Preparation matters. The Corsair, bent-winged and whistling, taught that lesson in blood. It still teaches it today if we choose to listen. And so, as we close this story, let us remember the Japanese pilots who once ruled the skies with unmatched confidence, only to face a machine that stripped them of every illusion. Let us remember the American pilots who flew the Corsair, who carried both pride and unease in their victories. Let us remember the engineers and workers who built the plane, whose efforts proved decisive in the greatest war the world has ever known. Above all, let us remember that war is not about machines alone, nor about courage alone, but about the fragile balance between them. The Corsair was more than an aircraft. It was a verdict. It judged Japan's technology inadequate, its tactics obsolete, its philosophy hollow. And yet, in delivering that verdict, it also planted the seeds of transformation, seeds that would grow into a peaceful, prosperous Japan, a nation remade not by swords but by factories. That is the Corsair's legacy. A destroyer of illusions, a teacher of truths, a reminder that in war as in life, wisdom often comes too late. But if we carry that wisdom forward, if we remember the fear of those pilots and the power of that machine, then perhaps their sacrifice was not in vain. Because history is not only about what was lost. It is also about what was learned.